is always releasing a shiny new commander into Rise of Kingdoms, with the current shiny new commander being Lao Che. But when you look at Rise of Kingdoms history, there are a lot of legendary commanders, like an absolute boatload of legendary commanders. So what does Lilith do with these? Some commanders they rework, some commanders they try to add other commanders to make them stronger, and some commanders just get completely forgotten. So today, I will be talking about these off-meta forgotten commanders and why it is actually bad for the game's health that a lot of the commanders in the game sit in this category. So if you want to know more about the forgotten commanders of Rise of Kingdoms, why it's bad for the game, should you even invest in any of these, and how Lilith can fix them, you want to stick around till the end of the video. Now let's start off today's video by discussing what makes an off-meta commander, and before we do that, I'll discuss the other two categories of commanders so we can fully understand what an off-meta commander is. And the first category I would like to discuss is the most obvious, the meta commanders. Commanders like Lao Che, Henry, Boudica, Yulang, commanders like Nevsky and Joan. These are meta commanders. They're the strongest on the whole entire game. They are literally the best of the best commanders, and the only way to access them is really through the Wheel of Fortune or Mightiest Governor, but they're so strong that they still are good investments, even though they don't have any real free value for their gold heads. They're still strong enough to justify actually investing in them, because they have lots of investment potential for the future, and they are currently really strong. So these commanders are the absolute meta. In the opposite to the absolute meta, you have reworked commanders, in my opinion. These are commanders which weren't very strong maybe a year or 2 years ago, but since the addition of the museum, since the addition of permanent legendary tavern, and more commanders in the daily special offer, have become more investment worthy. So for example, Mehmed is a great example, because when we look at Mehmed 2-3 years ago, he wasn't too good on the open field, especially in Season of Conquest, but then they gave him a massive museum relic, and now he's a fairly good early game investment, a fairly good middle game investment, a fairly good late game investment, and you can get him really easily through just opening gold chests, which is literally free. You don't have to spend any gems on this. You get one of these free every day. You'll get a ton of gold keys guaranteed by the time you're at the end game. So you're getting guaranteed free legendary sculptures for Mehmed, who's pretty much a meta commander at this point, because when you look at his kit, he's not absolute meta, but he is a decent commander on the open field, and you can invest in him very cheaply. He's really easy to unlock. I haven't put a single gold head in him besides ones that I've gotten for free, so he's definitely one of those reworked commanders. Easy to access, decent on the open field, and a good substitute to a meta commander if you're looking to make a murder ball without using some of the more expensive commanders, or you're trying to save as many gold heads as possible while still getting value. So rework commanders still have a place in Rise of Kingdoms, but off-meta commanders, which are the main focus of today's video, do not really have a place in the game. They're either really difficult to access, that means they're not in Legendary Tavern, they're not inside of a daily special offer, they're not even in Orotark Tavern, they're just really difficult to access. They're not very good on the open field. When you look at their kits, they're very average commanders. They may have something going for them, but they might not be the strongest. And they also don't have any buffs, like no museum relics coming anytime soon, and they're fairly new to the game. They used to be good, but they were really outpaced very quickly, and that's what makes an off-meta commander. So how are some commanders in the off-meta? And the best way to explain this is pretty much by giving an example. And I think the best example out there is probably Gilgamesh, because he's one commander I've always said needs to be somewhere else to make him more available besides just the Wheel of Fortune. And the way Gilgamesh ended up off meta was that he got replaced way too quickly. He was probably the last commander I think released before the next real generation of commanders, because I think it was Gilgamesh and then a leadership, and then they threw in Alexander Nevsky, who is obviously an absolute beast on the open field, just destroys everything. So Gilgamesh stood no chance against the cavalry meta, but the thing is, he still held a really strong debuff, a 30% health reduction, which no other commander in the game besides Ethelflaed had at the time, and Ethelflaed's debuff was only for 2 seconds, while Gilgamesh's was for 3 seconds, so a lot of players ran Gilgamesh for that regard, and his damage factor was actually decent at the time. It wasn't amazing, but it was decent, and he held a few other things. He had a lot of archer health, a lot of archer damage, and he also did a nice blood-craving debuff, which really stopped people who were running Richard from fully benefiting from a Richard's heal. So Gilgamesh held some value at the time, but his value really tanked when they released Scipio Africanus, who came pretty much right after Nevsky, because Scipio Africanus has a 30% health debuff AoE on his active skill, and that easily knocked Gilgamesh out of the meta, and that is probably the one thing that killed Gilgamesh, the release of Scipio Africanus, especially that soon after Gilgamesh was released. It was maybe 6 to 8 months after when Scipio came in with Gilgamesh's debuff, but stronger in an AoE. So that's what made Gilgamesh go into the off meta, but at the time we didn't really have museum relics, Legendary Tavern wasn't permanent, it didn't really matter too much that he was only in the Wheel of Fortune. But nowadays, Gilgamesh is nowhere else in the game. You cannot get Gilgamesh even in the daily special offer. He's not currently available in it. So he's in a really, really tough position where you can only get his gold heads by using your own generic sculptures or by spinning the Wheel of Fortune, which no one wants to do for an average commander at best. So when we look at a commander like Gilgamesh, they've fallen into the off meta because they're difficult to access, they're average on the open field, especially compared to the meta, and they don't have any buffs coming soon, and they don't have any other ways to access them coming soon unless Lilith does a major update. So should you consider getting an off meta commander? And I think the answer to that is an easy no. A commander like Gilgamesh is average on the field, and if you have him currently, you're going to probably run him because you want to get as much value as you can from him, and that's a fairly good reason because he's not too bad on the open field. If you currently own him, you could easily use him. The thing is, for investment, he's probably down there with some of the worst commanders in the game because you can't benefit from a museum relic, you can't buy him in daily special offer, you can't get him in legendary tavern, he's not even in the Oratok tavern, so he's easily one of the worst commanders in the game unless you're buying the recharge event, which even then he's definitely worse value than meta commanders. So Gilgamesh lies in one of those spots where he's a bad investment. The same for Honda. He's okay on the open field. He's decent as a secondary to a bunch of commanders, but when you look at his investment, you have to only get him from Wheel of Fortune. He has no museum relic. He's not coming to daily special offer. He's definitely not coming to legendary tavern. So he's an off-meta, pretty bad investment. A Minotaur is an example. Pakal is a very good example because when you look at Pakal, he's in the exact same boat as Gilgamesh, exact same boat as a Minotaur. CJ is another example. All these commanders are difficult to access. They're not even in the daily special offer, and they're only pretty much able to be leveled up through either pretty much spending your gold heads or spending your gems, which is definitely not good value. So all these commanders are fairly bad investments, and the only time I would ever pick up an off-meta commander is only if one thing occurs, and that is if they're in the daily special offer at the minimum. If you're willing to spend the money and you want an off-meta commander like Nebu, who I would say is off-meta, you can get him from the daily special offer, and that at least gives him a lot more value than a commander like a Minotaur who's Mightiest Governor only, and you can't get her gold there's literally any other way. So a commander like Nebuchadnezzar or anyone inside of the daily special offer is definitely higher value than commanders that aren't in the daily special offer, and that makes them a little bit more valuable than some of the really off-meta commanders and really forgotten commanders in the game. So the only time I'd pick up an off-meta commander like Nebu, and only if you're looking to run 3 or more Archer Marchers, because at that point, you're kind of pressed on the commanders you can pick, and Nebuchadnezzar is probably one of the better bets there, but even then, he's definitely not the best commander in the game, so I wouldn't recommend him for most players. Only if you're trying to make a really off-meta mutable would you even consider getting an off-meta commander. So now that we know what an off-meta commander is, why are off-meta commanders bad for Rise of Kingdoms? And in the simplest terms, it's because they are really, really annoying to access, and players who do want to use these commanders are left at a major disadvantage. So let's say in comparison, if you want to run Charles Martel on the open field, he is a cheap investment. I have pretty much put 11 gold heads in him when I was a big noob, and other than that, I've spent nothing on him. I've got a bunch of his gold heads literally sitting here right now, and he's a decent open field commander, so if you want to use him, you have access to his relic. He comes in the gold key, you get it from the daily special offer, you can get it from the Mightiest Governor really early game, and he's good in the early game, so he's a very, very decent commander if you wanted to actually choose to invest in him especially. But if a player wanted to invest in a Pakal or a CJ nowadays, they're left at a bigger disadvantage than a player who invests in a Charles Martel, and that really shouldn't be the case because Pakal and CJ are stronger than Martel, but they're not that strong where you should leave yourself at that big of a disadvantage to really justify running them. That's the real big issue with an off-meta commander, because a commander like Pakal is strong on the open field, but he's annoying to access, he's really expensive to invest in, so he's easily left in a very annoying position. No one's ever going to want to use him if he's a fairly bad investment compared to commanders like Charles Martel, who you think would be weaker than a Pakal, yet he might be slightly weaker, though he's got a much more valuable museum relic, he's way more ways to access him, and he's just much better overall investment value than a commander like Pakal. And this leaves the game in a completely unequal state. It's not even close. Obviously, if you put Pakal with a museum relic and chuck him in legendary tavern and daily special offer and gold chest like Charles Martel, it would make Charles Martel a very off-meta commander. But the thing is, you could leave Charles Martel with a double relic, and then you could just throw in Pakal with a single relic into a legendary chest at the very minimum, and he would become a fairly usable commander again. It would be more justifiable to invest in Pakal if he can get his gold heads from stuff like Heart's Desire and Legendary Tavern, rather than only from the Mightiest Governor, which definitely makes him much lower value and much more difficult to invest in for players who do want to invest in them, and then leaves them once again at a massive disadvantage compared to other players, especially players who want meta commanders only. A player who wants to or needs to invest in an off-meta commander for their meta ball, even if they're a whale, is left at a massive disadvantage because either they run a weaker commander like Martel, or they invest in the off-meta commanders, which are very bad investments, and there's no other ways to access their gold heads besides pretty much using generics, and those are probably when the players get really screwed over, and that's why it's very bad for the game. It's because it makes players who need to invest in these commanders struggle to invest in them, or it leaves them in a very bad state compared to the other players in the game. So how could we fix off-meta commanders? And I think the real simple way to fix off-meta commanders, there's a few things. First of all, once a commander's been in the game for more than a year, put them in the daily special offer. No one is going to be investing in Gilgamesh right now unless you even consider putting him in the daily special offer. Someone might invest in him for rally, and that at least gives him some value again. But if a commander is not in the daily special offer at the bare minimum, they're not going to be good. So after a year, pretty much every single commander, unless they're in the absolute meta, and I think Lilith can easily make a judgment on that, should be in the daily special offer. So a commander like Nevsky, I don't think should be in there. It'll be way too overpowered. But a commander like Gilgamesh, I don't know why he's not in here already. Or a commander like Pakal should definitely be in there. And especially a commander like CJ should 100% be in the daily special offer. Or even in a Manatori to give your Artemisia from the daily special offer some value if you're investing in other commanders. So when you look at the daily special offer, it's actually a good way to bring some of these off-meta commanders at least a little bit more value, even for those spender players, and that's at least going to make them more usable on the open field and a slightly better investment. The other way to make off-meta commanders strong again is not necessarily to buff them through Museum, it's more to allow us to access their gold heads in cheaper ways. So one thing that Lilith should be doing is adding commanders to the Legendary Tavern. I think the last time they added one was Margaret, and besides Margaret, they've pretty much added literally nothing. I think Zhang Yu or Nebula may have been the literal last commander they've added, and since then, nothing has been added to the Legendary Chest, and this is a fairly good value event for low spenders free-to-plays. You get a bunch of free rewards by logging in, but the commanders are not very good, and because of that, you'd want them to add some stronger commanders to at least make it so players who want to invest in that commander like Gilgamesh or Pakal have the option to get that commander through the Legendary Tavern. So especially with Pakal and Manatori and other commanders on the Mightiest Governor, you don't have to go to the Mightiest Governor to get them. You can get them from doing the Legendary Chest, which at least makes them a much easier unlock so you can actually invest in them, and at least you could get maybe an extra 20, 30, 40 gold heads from an event like Heart's Desire, which makes those commanders a cheaper investment, especially if you don't plan to expertise. So getting 40 gold heads from Legendary Chest or Heart's Desire might be a fifth of the cost towards a 5511 commander, which is much better than getting no gold heads and having to pay the full price, and at least allows you to access that commander in a more valuable way than just generic gold heads, gems, or using speed ups in the Mightiest Governor. So when we look at these commanders, what they really need the most is another way to access them to at least make them a decent investment compared to some of the current meta commanders. Now, one final way to fix the off-meta commander issue is through giving them museum relics. I think that is a very, very simple thing to do, but it also shouldn't be that simple. I don't think we should just give these commanders more stats. Like if Ramses got a museum relic, which I think he definitely is worthy of, he shouldn't just get an extra 20% attack, 20% health, call it a day. I think they should give commanders stats that actually help fulfill places in murder balls where other commanders don't do it. So for example, let's say right now a commander that's really good is Mehmed as a great secondary, and let's say they put in a commander like Suleiman into the museum and they gave him a ton of stats and made him a really good legendary secondary. They put him in the Legendary Tavern, they put him in the daily special offer. Well, then Mehmed completely falls out of the meta because Suleiman now will just replace him. And this is just an outfetched example, but if let's say that is the case, Mehmed is a commander who now no one's going to invest in, and then Mehmed falls into the off-meta position, which makes him a bad investment not only in the museum, but it also makes him a bad investment in the whole entire game, which is obviously going to restart the whole off-meta cycle. But what they should do instead is give a commander unique buffs, which will once again fill a place in a player's murder ball. So for example, right now, Boudica Prime inflicts a really strong skill damage increase debuff. For now, it is a strong debuff. What they might do with a commander like Ramses is give them like 15% skill damage increase on their active skill from a museum relic. I know that sounds very strong, but it would fill a place of a Boudica and a Murder Ball with a commander that a lot of players either already own or could get for a cheaper price if they put him in Legendary Tavern, which he already is in Legendary Tavern, and if they put him into Daily Special Offer, even though he already is in it, just as an example, these commanders would be easier to use on the open field and would be a good placeholder commander, especially while you work on some of the later commanders, and even would hold value after that if they fill unique places in Murder Balls. Like Mehmed holds a lot of value even in the late game because he's a really good secondary. YSG holds a lot of value because he's got crazy AoE and his museum relic just adds to that. So all these commanders hold unique value in the museum, and if we repeat that again with Season 3 commanders and other Season of Conquest commanders, we can easily help reduce the off-meta issue and help these commanders gradually come back into the usability and play in Rise of Kingdoms for newer players or players who want to actually use these commanders on the open field for various reasons, whether they already own them or they're looking to get them for a unique mutable, or these commanders would have at least some usage if they got a museum relic, or they were added to Legendary Tavern Daily Special Offer, or just any other ways to access their gold heads. Now that I've said what I think about off-meta commanders and why I think that they deserve museum relics and more attention in Rise of Kingdoms, what do you guys think? Do you think these commanders are in a good enough position where players who already own them can use them and other players who want to invest in them just shouldn't invest in them? Or do you think that we should actually add these commanders into the museum, make them more accessible and make them stronger for the open field? Or would that just shake up the meta a little bit too much? So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I respond to every single comment. It's the best way to ask me any questions, and it also supports me as a creator because YouTube really likes those comments. Now, I just want to say thank you for watching and I hope to see you in the next one.